Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into the epic 91-year saga of Andrew Dye Sr. We're talking about a life literally carved out of the early American frontier. It's a wild story, completely defined by pure survival, stubborn rebellion, and oh yeah, a massive family feud that spanned generations. Let's get right into it.
Seriously, ask yourself, would you sue the titans of American industry for $33 million over a 99-year-old family rumor? I mean, just imagine discovering a legend passed down through your family that your ancestor left behind a massive fortune in prime real estate. Sounds like a Hollywood movie plot, right? But it actually happened, and it set the stage for an explosive family legend that we're going to unpack for you today.
So, Part 1. The Lawless Frontier.
Andrew's life was basically defined by stark contrast. He started out in the stable, coastal community of Cranberry, New Jersey, born there in 1744. You know, he really could have just lived a quiet, normal life there, but instead he felt this massive pull of the West. By 1771, he had arrived in the volatile, highly disputed Big Whiteley Creek frontier in southwestern Pennsylvania. Guys, this was a lawless powder keg. We're talking about the absolute knife edge of civilization at the time.
If we track his westward geographical expansion, we see him move from New Jersey south to Maryland by 1768. And it was actually in Maryland that he married Sarah Minor. She was a woman who brought her own incredible history to the table. She was directly connected to the family tree of Martha Washington. By 1771, Andrew and Sarah pushed further into Pennsylvania, and eventually, much later on in 1804, they'd pack up again and head into the newly opened Ohio Territory.
Moving on to Part 2, War in the Wilderness. Okay, so the political chaos of this era was honestly incredibly bizarre. Both Virginia and Pennsylvania claimed the exact same soil that Andrew was living on. Virginia called it Yohogania County, while Pennsylvania claimed it as Westmoreland County. Because of this mess, Andrew literally had to shift his military service. In early 1780, he was commissioned as a first lieutenant for Virginia. But when Virginia's hold collapsed later that same year, he just shifted right over to the Pennsylvania line, serving there with the militia rank of captain.
Now, you got to understand, his military service was vastly different from what we usually picture. This wasn't about grand marches in the East, lining up in open fields against British redcoats. No, this was terrifying, brutal guerrilla warfare. Andrew often served day-to-day as an enlisted ranger. His actual everyday job was defending these isolated, totally vulnerable pioneer settlements from brutal ambushes and sudden raids by British-aligned Native American war parties along the Monongahela and Ohio rivers. Just a terrifying reality to wake up to.
Well, after surviving that incredibly bloody theater of war, the interstate border dispute was finally settled in Pennsylvania's favor, and as a reward for his service in 1785, Andrew was handed a Pennsylvania land warrant. In just a beautiful bit of historical irony, this battle-hardened, rugged frontiersman was rewarded with a tract of land featuring an incredibly cozy, peaceful name, Sparrow's Nest.
Which brings us to Part 3, Clashes with the Church. Because, let's be real, peaceful is literally the last word you would ever use to describe Andrew Dye. You see, out on the frontier, the church often acted as the moral court for the community. It effectively kept the earliest forms of criminal records. Now, Andrew and his family were members of the Goshen Baptist Church, but starting as early as 1776, the church minutes paint this vivid picture of a guy with a serious, fiery temper. He was called out for quarreling at Squire Van Meter's property on Muddy Creek, a local gathering spot where Andrew just frequently found trouble. And the list of offenses just kept growing over the decade. We're talking repeated swearing, fighting, and generally unseemly behavior.
For years, the church elders tried to reel him in, attempting to reclaim their wandering sheep, but Andrew absolutely refused to tame his tongue or his fists. The congregation finally just lost all patience. On December 19, 1789, the Goshen Baptist Church officially excommunicated him, just kicked him right out.
All right, Part 4, The 99-Year Lease Myth.
So according to family lore, when Andrew left Pennsylvania for Ohio around 1804, he didn't sell his vast land holdings outright. Instead, the rumor claimed he disposed of them via 99-year leases. Now this single, supposed decision became a legendary bedtime story. It was passed down through the Dye family generations, basically sitting there like a ticking time bomb, just waiting to erupt exactly 99 years later.
And erupt it absolutely did. Fast forward to 1904. The rumor spread like wildfire that the 99-year leases had officially expired. And guess what? That prime real estate back at Sparrow's Nest was now occupied by the booming Pennsylvania Railroad and several major industrial factories. Convinced they were sitting on an absolute gold mine, over 500 of Andrew's descendants pooled their money, hired high-priced attorneys, and launched a staggering $33 million lawsuit against the railroad to reclaim the land. Can you imagine?
So what does this all mean? What actually happened? Well, the courts eventually ruled against the Andrew Dye Association. The judges declared that the land had legally changed hands way too many times to count, and the original right to sell had not been voided. So, yeah, they ultimately lost to the industrial titans. But this glittering, massive lawsuit remains an absolutely legendary chapter of frontier family folklore.
Let's look at the final chapter in Part 5, An Unyielding Legacy.
Even in his final decades, Andrew's reputation as a guy who simply wouldn't back down only grew stronger. After his first wife Sarah died, his domestic life in Ohio stayed highly dramatic. In 1813, an aging Andrew actually traveled to Kentucky and married a widow named Ann Evans. This highly controversial second marriage deeply angered his adult children. They viewed their new stepmother with intense suspicion, and it sparked a bitter family feud that simmered for decades.
And Andrew, completely true to form, held a major grudge. In a final act of frontier defiance, an 88-year-old Andrew stubbornly penned his last will and testament in 1832. He left the vast majority of his estate and wealth directly to his new wife, Anne. He effectively cut his kids right out of the picture, leaving only token, honestly insulting pocket change to his 9 surviving children and their heirs. It was a remarkably petty and uncompromising final statement from a man who always needed the last word.
But here's the thing, despite all that family friction, he was deeply respected in his broader community. And amazingly, we actually have a record of his own voice. On July 4, 1827, at an Independence Day banquet in Troy, Ohio, Andrew stood up as one of the very last surviving Revolutionary War veterans. Raising his glass, the 83-year-old delivered a passionate toast, calling for health and prosperity to all who assisted in throwing off the heavy yoke of British tyranny.
To really put things into perspective and grasp the sheer scale of his legacy, consider this number. By the time Andrew passed away, his total posterity numbered nearly 500 individuals. That is massive. He lived to see 5 generations of his own bloodline expand across the American landscape. In fact, he actually outlived 140 of his own descendants, leaving 360 alive to mourn him.
He finally passed away on July 5, 1835, at the incredible age of 91. He rests today in Pleasant Hill Cemetery in Ohio. His stone is still standing there, flanked by a bronze marker placed by the Sons of the American Revolution. It's a quiet, enduring monument to a fierce, brawling American original.
And so we leave you with this thought today. When you consider Andrew Dye Sr.'s incredible 91-year journey, from fighting the British and surviving brutal guerrilla warfare, to getting excommunicated for brawling, to stubbornly cutting his own kids out of his will, is history truly made by the well-behaved? Or was the early American frontier actually built by the stubborn, the unyielding, and the survivors? Thanks for joining us for this explainer. We'll see you next time.